The Greens MP Adam Bandt has been speaking to the media at Parliament House in Canberra. He's discussing Qantas's decision to cut 500 jobs in the wake of that big fall in profit. He's also planning to talk about government retention of coercive powers for the Australian Building Commission. Let's go there live now.
Last year, Qantas workers were bargaining for job security protections in their workplace, and they feared that there might be cuts, and they feared that there might be some offshoring. Qantas then stepped in and used an industrial atom bomb by grounding its fleet, to bypass bargaining and end up in Fair Work Australia. We are now seeing Qantas profiting from its extreme industrial tactics. Qantas is profiting from its own wrong at the expense of workers. We've seen a growth in Qantas's revenue, we've seen Qantas's share price go up, and yet hundreds of workers, and potentially more depending on the outcome of the review, are going to end up on the scrap heap. There is something wrong with a Fair Work Act when an employer like Qantas is able to use extreme industrial tactics and profit from it. The Fair Work Act needs to be fixed to prevent a recurrence of this kind of situation. When Parliament resumes in a couple of weeks, I'll be introducing a bill to make job security and full employment one of the objects of the Fair Work Act, and also to take steps to prevent employers from using these kind of extreme industrial tactics and getting away with it. I've also this morning in Parliament just seen another shift from the government on what was meant to be one of its core principles. We've just passed legislation in Parliament that unfortunately means that building workers in this country continue to have less rights than accused criminals. If you turn up to work either in a hard hat and boots, then you have less rights than someone who turns up in a suit and a tie, because it remains the case now, despite our efforts to change the laws, that building workers can be hauled in for secret interrogations, can be required to name names, and this is all a result of the Labor government deciding to keep Howard-era McCarthyist coercive powers, even though it had the numbers there in the Parliament this morning to remove them. We were able to successfully negotiate an improvement to the bill, which will mean that workers and their representatives aren't going to be subject to double jeopardy, which is being prosecuted by not only their employers but also by the Building Industry Commission. So fortunately that's going to change, and that's an issue that, to the government's credit, it was alive to as well. But we now have a two-tier system in this country entrenched, and I think that if an official could walk into a shop or an office and take a worker out and pull them in for secret questioning simply because they worked in that sector, there'd be an outcry. And yet it remains the case that building industry workers have fewer rights than accused criminals.
But Qantas, they posted an 83% slump in profits, so does that not, even though they still did post a profit, that's an 83% slump?
Well, $194 million of their loss comes from the industrial action that Alan Joyce caused. We have a situation where Alan Joyce and Qantas are profiting from their own wrong. They grounded the fleet.
But
that caused them an enormous loss. Well, they grounded the fleet in response to pilots wearing red ties. Now, the extreme industrial action that that Qantas has engaged in, that the airline has engaged in, was designed to bypass the bargaining process so that they could end up cutting jobs without the employees having adequate protections. And we're seeing today, unfortunately, the strategy succeeded, and we need to fix the Act to prevent that from happening again.
It is Qantas's responsibility to, in order of preference?
Well,
customers, workers and shareholders.
Qantas's responsibility is to the country, first and foremost. It's our national airline.
But
it receives significant government support. There is government legislation, or there's legislation overseeing it. It's required to be an Australian airline. it should have the interests of the country first and foremost, and that includes the interests of the workers. I mean, let's be clear. Qantas's revenue has just gone up by 5%, and yet it still says it wants to sack hundreds of workers.
Adam, if you were so concerned about the coercive powers, why did you support the bill in the end?
Because we were able to get some amendments which we think on balance are better than the status quo. But we just need to be clear that we wanted to get rid of the coercive powers. The numbers were there in Parliament, and the only reason they've stayed is because Labor wants them.
Will your colleagues in the Senate push harder for more amendments?
Oh, look, our position is clear. We want to see the coercive powers go, but this agreement that's been reached with the government is what will pass the Senate. Thanks very much.